back to Aimless Ramblings. This is episode 23, and we're going to be focusing on the topic of honor and morality. To start off with, I'm just going to throw over to Sam, who's going to talk about the nature of morality.
G'day, children in the deep interweb space. I'm going to have a rambling conversation about whether or not morality is actually something that's unique to humans, or if morality is actually just a name we have given for an animalistic and evolutionary trait. So, you've got your Hobbesian views, essentially. They're like, we are savage beasts, brutish in nature. And all there is this little veneer of morality that keeps us from, raping and pillaging and blah, blah, blah. And, I've been doing a bit of reading, and, it doesn't really click if you look at, say, a group organism's survival. So, say you've got chimpanzees, right? If they all, act in solely self-interested behavior, very quickly this group's going to fail. And then a group that doesn't solely this is in terms of the individual, acting in the individualistically selfish action, the group's going to fail, right? A group that doesn't will succeed, and, being good little Darwinists, we all know that the group that is fittest will survive. And this is one of those things where survival of a group versus an individual becomes thing. So, you will see primates that will expend energy, precious energy, to care for a non-direct kin. So, they're all related to each other. They all share a degree of genetic material, but they will, take care of each other's children, primarily the women in this case. So, the individual benefits to a degree because someone else will take care of their child, but overall, it's not a wholly selfish action. And murder is named. There's a book called Morality Among Animals, which is in the American Psych org, the APA thing. And it, lists 4 key foundations for morality, which both apply to humans and animals. So the first one being the recognition of property. So, it's amoral to take someone's possessions by force, just like an animal won't. Well, not always, and just like not always with a human. But, animals regard each other's nests, and, they have respect for that. A bird won't nest in another bird's nest unless it's intentionally being aggressive. It's polite, which is what we are, We won't take someone's possessions unless we are being intentionally aggressive towards them. Anyone who's ever owned a dog and has come home when the dog's done something wrong, whether or not it's truly shame, I'll show you in a second, Tim, whether or not, the dog is truly exhibiting shame, or it's, got enough foresight to know its action is going to result in a negative behavior, it's a bit difficult to tell, but, broadly speaking, they exhibit shame. They cooperate, even when it is, like I said, with caring for someone else's children. They don't directly benefit. In fact, it arguably decreases their survivability as an individual. And they tend to reciprocate care, which I guess you could be called kindness or appreciation. Tim?
So, pretty good question, Sam. And I think bringing it back to Hobbes and Rousseau, those two seminal thinkers from an Enlightenment perspective sort of really highlights how much of an enduring issue this is in terms of trying to come to a solution. One thing I was going to say, though, is that there's been some really good work by a guy, Robert Sapolsky. He's like a neurobiologist in the States, has done a lot of also behavioral study in chimpanzees. And he talks about, from an evolutionary perspective, that 100% what you've raised in terms of an individual creature acting in a completely amoral, quote unquote, individualistic manner, like a complete psychopath, maybe. And Simon, you can feel free to stomp on me for that. Yeah, but you have if you have a group of organisms that they actually have an evolutionary advantage if they compete, not if they don't compete, sorry, if they work together. And he talks about, in terms of psychology, from a neurobiological sense. He sort of tapes it down to like 3 drivers in terms of sort of like support and protection. So, you've got self-preservation, which is the organism attempting to preserve itself, which is obviously a pretty big thing you need to have if that organism is going to actually reproduce, go on and survive. But then he talks about, kin selection. And it's this idea that if organisms defend those that are, in terms of genetically close to them, their genetic material is more likely to propagate over time. And the joke he says is, I'd gladly lay down my life for 2 brothers or 4 cousins. It's like the idea of exchanging some of my life, or exchanging, or putting risk on myself to benefit other people who are genetically related to me is beneficial. And I think one of the interesting things from a human perspective maybe is that the fungibility of who is a kin, because obviously we don't necessarily, I mean, maybe some species do in terms of pheromones, etc., become like hardwired in with an ability to tell who isn't and who is kin. And so like for at least mammals and for humans and primates, a big part of that whole perceptual process and cognitive process and the fungibility of who is and what isn't a person is where we assign sort of the willingness to die and protect people who aren't our kin, who aren't our direct relatives. And maybe even in terms of so fungible, we're willing to, for instance, assign personhood or protection towards abstract concepts like liberty or a state. And I was going to say the final thing he talks about from a selection driver perspective is that altruism in social species, even if they're not kin related, also has a competitive advantage for that species in terms of making sure that the genetic material propagates. So that's, I mean, from those 3, you could definitely say if you were reductive in your, like a reductive biologist, you could say that those 3 are all that's required for the development of ethics in individuals. Simon, you got your hand up?
Pretty much from Sam's discussion and then further explored by Tim, all I got was that in communal species, there's sort of this putting the meme before the gene in this sort of way that it's more important to the individual within the community that rather than them genetically being able to pass it on, that their idea of their existence is passed on is more important in that community. Be that, as simple as, well, that person laid down their life for, the 4 cousins. So therefore, those 4 cousins will know that that's a policy or that's an idea that's important to that society. And because of that action, they were able. So those 4 cousins might go, oh, wow, that was an action that occurred to save us. So if they're in a similar situation, they are able to save 4. So there is just more numerical people, inverted, learning this knowledge. And as such, that the gene is sort of a secondary to the meme. What do you guys think about that? Tim?
Yeah, I think you've sort of raised something that's really interesting, right? So as soon as with humans, and you've got, I can't remember how long ago it was, 200,000 years ago when you have the linguistic revolution, have this massive explosion of technology as theorized, that's potentially the period at which we actually started, speaking like languages as opposed to, less grammatically complex forms of communication. So maybe because humans have evolved in this extremely novel manner towards language, and we have this ability to really abstract away from pure concrete experience, that we are dealing with something completely different compared to our pure mammalian or primate ancestors and cousins. So in the sense that 100% what you're saying, the meme before the gene here, we've got individuals who aren't you don't even have to lay down your life for your cousin. The example of the martyr laying down their life for a completely unexperienced and a completely, intellectual idea of, going to heaven, for instance, or, the proletariat's cause, or, for the blood and glory of the nation. What do you think, Sam? In terms of, would you say that reductionist biology doesn't really capture the nuances of the sociology as we've developed, or do you think that you only really need the biological explanation?
Broadly speaking, I'd say, personal opinion, I subscribe to most of our acculturation is, for instance, to use the appreciation of abstract art, it's essentially just something that evolved under the strict evolutionary pressure, just a byproduct of it, like consciousness for the most part, I think, is a byproduct of living in more advanced societies, like a more complex, larger group. And I think most of what you guys, the meme before the gene, I think is primarily following hard-coded genetic drives to preserve the group, because, DNA doesn't understand who it truly is or isn't related to, really. So, in the case of, the Christian martyr, the Christians are their tribe, are their genetic material, so they lay down their life so their genetic material can pass on. That's all in square codes, because, again, it's just this byproduct of an evolutionary driver. So I don't necessarily think it's a greater than the beasts as such. I think it's just the same thing, but put into a more complex environment where it just runs to a different endpoint. But you guys have pretty well hashed over what I had, so I might throw to Tim next.
Cheers, Sam. So I'm taking the conversation sort of, I think we're going to be discussing some of the similar themes, but in a slightly different direction. Now, when we raised the topic of honor and morality, something that has been particularly big in terms of discussion regarding ethics has been, in the last 20 years at least, has been honor killings. Now, there is an entire realm here where we need to recognize, like, from a neo-Orientalist's perspective, like, there is a huge focus on, for instance, honor killings in African and Central Asian and South Asian communities, when at the same time, as I was saying before this entire discussion, you see similar things occur in, like, the American South. You see amongst white communities there, you see similar things occur historically in most European societies, particularly amongst aristocracy, right up until the 1900s, or the turn of the century there, before World War One. I mean, duels were increasingly less common towards the back end of the 1800s, but that was still a thing. But what I wanted to look at is, so honor killings, I suppose, are just like the archetypal example of what I would say honor and morality as retribution. So it seems, and we talked about this, I think, a few times with regards to violence, with regards to crime and punishment, that there is a reformative aspect of that legal system, but there's also a punitive aspect. And it seems to me, at least, that within the human psychology, and I think it's hardwired as opposed to, something that's conditioned or learned, that we want, we see, like, there is a status quo of, like, justice and fairness, which I mean, those words don't necessarily mean, something noble, just in terms of, like, we see there is a way that things should be, and when something upsets it, we believe that we should be able to react and retaliate violently so as to either restore the status quo, but also to demonstrate to others who would seek to upset said status quo that we will violently prevent that from occurring and ensure that they cannot interfere with it again. And so what I was going to ask you, like, I suppose, like, it plays out in our criminal system. It plays out, like, I mean, the psychology that plays out in video games where, someone gets killed and teabagged on a Call of Duty server or a, Counter-Strike server, and then they get, like, really angry and they go chase down this dude. I mean, like, in one case, we have someone chase down someone in real life and stab them over I think it was a Counter-Strike match relatively recently. So do you think that retribution is something that we have socialized into us? I obviously don't. Or do you think it's something that is hardwired? Throw to you first, Simon.
This is probably going to sound like I'm shooting myself in the foot, but harkening back to what Sam says, and then through yours, he's talking about how there's, like, this very animalistic hardwired thing. What I think it is it's primitive forces being forced through the sort of the purification of what societal expectation is. So, for example, you'll notice that even when you go to the very earliest criminology textbooks, the earliest ones actually just for hunting down witches. That's actually the earliest form of criminology / criminal justice text. And it's all about the process of how do you equate sort of that every party is like honored. Because without the sort of witch hunt or whatnot, or the criminal justice system, there was this endless battle between two families who were trying to restore honor. So there was this way that, like, we can't have like two very large families just using whole entire towns as their fighting realm, just because it was the way of trying to make it much smaller, rather than having to throw hundreds of people at each other, or whole clans throwing whole clans at each other to regain honor. So in a lot of ways, I feel like it's a hand-in-hand of justice and honor, and it's how do you retain honor not only for the hurt party, but also the party who perpetrated it. And that, I think, is where it comes in, is this whole entire idea of, as you were discussing, the idea is it a Jules in its simplest form was sort of a, how can we make this between these two people and then make it a formalized event, and therefore the violent action is only between these two individuals. However, if you extend it beyond that, I'm just rambling off, so I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to discuss.
Yeah, so I think, Tim, primarily it's just reciprocity, well, whatever. Someone does something nice to us, we do something nice back to them. It's rooted in animal behavior as well. Like something I found when I was looking at my other stuff is macaws. So super common to have revenge, if you want to call it that, attacks. And they'll, including like, so say you've got a large alpha or whatever the fuck, big monkey beats up little monkey, right? Little monkey can never beat up big monkey again, right? Because he's too big. What little monkey might do is beat up big monkey's babies. So there's even that degree of, if I can't get vengeance on you directly, I will target you through an alternate method as well in animals, and it's comparatively common, at least in chimps and other primates. Anyone with a cat will say if they've annoyed their cat, does it piss in their clothing or something? If that's vengeance, I don't know. But I truthfully think it's just the animalistic thing again. So, say you were using with the example of class. It's the class becomes the social group. And I mean, especially in medieval Europe, relationship ties were very strong within the upper classes. What do you reckon?
I definitely would agree with that characterization when you're saying that for tit for tat sort of, I do something nice, you do something nice, blah, blah, blah. I'd actually also say, so once again, Robert Sapolsky, I swear I'm not getting kickbacks, but he, in his course, he talks about biology and human behavior. One of the things he talks about is some of the modeling they were doing with this altruism experiment in terms of trying to understand like when it would be beneficial to cooperate, when it would be beneficial to cheat. They use different methods to try and see how which kind of system would work. And I think that any sort of system of similar species, like for humans, for instance, there is always going to be a parasitic element, because there's always going to be times when gaming the system or cheating the system means that you get more and therefore you have an advantage, which would be an evolutionary advantage. However, if everybody does it, then as you've already pointed out, no one wins. And in fact, everyone lives a much worse life compared to if everyone cooperated. And so what they were doing a lot of this experimenting was that they found that in a large population, there's always going to be a small percentage of the cheaters. And maybe, I don't know, Simon, you could correct me, like people with like personality disorders, that could be a genetic expression. I'm not 100% sure if all of them are exactly that, of that small cheating element, which can naturally thrive in a large enough society. But for everybody else, when he's talking about this large enough community, generally speaking, if everyone is just a giver, if everyone's always nice all the time, of course they're going to take an advantage of. But the issue is that if you don't, if you punish people all the time, then you end up with this problem of signal error. So maybe I didn't actually mean to hurt you, that was an accident. And so you just end up in a cycle of violence. So what he says is that although tit for tat kind of is how most organisms will function in a way that actually, if they're cooperating, will benefit together, you got to have like a forgiving tit for tat. So it's like tit for tat, but then occasionally, like if you haven't had a go at me for a little while, then I won't have a go for you, and then maybe we can restore that kind of relationship. And I suppose maybe that's like what the circuit breaker of the law does in our current societies, or the idea of grace and forgiveness. Sam?
Most creatures have a degree of communication, though, Tim. So, like, an accidental slight, for instance, most animals that live in complex social groups have mechanisms for lack of a better term, apologizing. If your dog accidentally bites you, they very quickly express that this was not an intentional action, or so on and so forth. So I guess it could be that's where the breaking comes in. You've got to have a degree of social complexity to be able to say, actually, that's an error, my bad. And then the other side go, I understand the concept of an error, and be that understand or be genetically programmed to be willing to forgive those that display submissive signals. I also wonder if the portion of cheaters, Tim, is the number that is not evolutionarily disadvantageous. Because as like a group would shift towards less and less those that are willing to cheat the system, the evolutionary advantage from having, say there are 5%, 4% doesn't offer much of an advantage over 5%. So I guess that could be why there's still that residual level, is it's just not actually enough of a selective pressure to eliminate all of those. Don't know.
No, definitely. And I definitely agree with you in terms of I just think like there's like such a breadth of potential personality and behavioral options that sort of come out the end of the pipe. There's we just have to deal with maybe like a residual element of the cheaters in the society, and maybe they serve other social functions, like maybe they break down calcified social systems that over time become less evolutionary advantageous. Simon, I believe you got something to say, but then also you've got a topic, so I'll throw it to you.
Okay, so first and foremost, I'm going to cover the idea that the cheaters are just there to develop a boundary so that we can have an us and them sort of mentality, because without the cheaters, we wouldn't understand cheaters in a respect. So by simply knowing that somebody is breaking the system, we understand the limits of the system. And by understanding the limits of the system, we're able to exist within the society by being opposed to a particular ideology. Anyway, just because I want to be a Jerry and we all agree with one another and we're all agreeable people, I'm going to discuss how sort of, as we've discussed earlier about that, forgiveness and whatnot. However, I'm going to separate it into individual morality versus group honor. So let's first and foremost bring up the Arch study from the wonderful time, which was 1951. We all remember that time, don't we, guys? I'm joking. None of us were born before. Anyway, so it's this whole conformity study that the more people that are within a group and are saying the opposite, so it's actually a line study, and there's everybody's saying the wrong answer, but for the first few, everybody's agreeing on the right answer, and then you'll be at the end of the line and everybody else will be, and it's all about that whole entire idea that if there is insurmountable data, that even if you don't agree with it, you are more likely to conform. However, if there is even a slight gap in that, so for example, they did many studies where, in this particular study, where they were the only people, where they were doing it anonymously, and also when they had at least one other person who agreed with them, and there was a drastic spike if there was at least one other person that agreed with them. But if they were alone and they had to actually verbally say it in front of all these people, they were more likely to conform. And this is where I think group honor, and then also the idea of diminished responsibility when it comes to the sort of criminal, but also I feel like it extends outside of the criminal thing, where you simply, by being part of a group, you can reduce your moral ambiguity. So, for example, if you morally don't agree with something, but it maintains or it, enhances the honor of the group, you're willing to able to make that trade. Whereas if you think something is moral but it is against what the group would think, then it's sort of it's easier to conform. It's that whole entire going towards the middle. That also, and I feel like there's also that issue that if there's another person that is outwardly agreeing with you, that's the reason why in a lot of movies and whatnot, there's always one person that's very vocally disagreeing, and then those people that were on the fence that are like, oh, I don't morally agree with this whole entire thing. There's sort of that whole entire sync. It doesn't usually happen to that extent, but there's many studies. If you guys want to see the little instance where somebody just chipped away at it, and as such, there was a lot of people who left that group. So yeah, it's that sort of argument. But what do you guys think? That whole entire group honor versus individual morality. Tim?
So, understanding group honor, I suppose, in the context of the stuff that we've talked about before this, honor and morality cannot really be divorced of group dynamics because they're essentially a function of interaction between organisms that we need to have some form of, a group morality which we subscribe to. So I suppose the dissonance that you're talking about there is something that is really a human thing because people exist across so many different groups that, depending on which particular identity or which particular group situation or contextual situation they're in at any one time, there's definitely going to be that point of dissonance. In terms of another really great example, though, I think, Simon, is that Dave Grossman, who's I don't even know if he's alive anymore, but he was he wrote the book On Killing. Army psychologist, talked about the issue of the psychology of killing and the impact it has. Now, he talks about how diminished responsibility in a communal setting makes killing easier. So, for instance, if I'm shooting at an individual by myself and I know that it's my bullet that's going to hit them and kill them, then it's actually really hard for someone to do that unless they've been trained essentially to disassociate the thing that they're shooting with being another human. And even then, we still have issues. However, if that person is part of a crewed weapon, so it's a crew of people working on the same weapon at the same time, that responsibility for the death, sort of it leaches away. And so, for instance, if they're a bunch of people operating a machine gun or a bunch of people operating a mortar tube, where they may still be seeing the target being hit and destroyed or killed by their actions, they don't feel the same level of responsibility. And I suppose what I'm saying here is that once we subsume the singular identity within a group context, I 100% agree with you. We no longer feel as though our actions from within the matrix of ourselves, if that makes any sense. So it's we're no longer a singular entity. We're part of another singular entity, which is the crew, which is serving the machine gun, or we're a bunch of people who are, making a comment on the length of a line, and it's less important about what we might have in other contexts have said, more important what the context of that particular group is the right thing to do. So I'm rambling a little bit. I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, that it's that whole entire, we're greater than the sum of our parts sort of idea that just because we're four men working on one machine, we're not really four men, we're four parts of a machine that is that single whole. And then there's also that whole entire idea that when we go back, all the way back to that morality and, criminal justice, and then also how there's the animal kingdom of, being able to say, oh, I'm sorry for that or whatnot. I feel like the only reason why we can do that thing of, oh, wow, that's a line I don't want to cross is because we've seen people cross that line. So I feel like, before the dog accidentally bites the hand of the owner, goes, oh, that's not what I meant. It's in some deep, dark genetic thing, is going back to its great ancestor who tried to bite the bigger dog and was like, yeah, you know what? I don't even care if I accidentally did that, and then just got absolutely ripped to this animal got like ripped to shreds, and its children were like, that's not what I want to do. And because it's this whole entire, it brings up another study where it comes to, there was a bunch of monkeys and they would climb the tree to get the banana, but they kept on spraying the monkey and then they'd punish all the other ones. And they kept on doing that until they reached a point where they didn't have a single monkey that had experienced the first action, but because they beat up the monkey that was climbing the tree that was making everybody get punished, you could actually maintain that social dynamic simply off the, none of them had experienced the primary, but all from the secondary actions of that were able to maintain the society. And I feel like so I don't think it's a uniquely human thing, but I definitely feel like it's to get it to pass from that, individual genetic unique thing to the, end goal where you don't even have to have the primary stimulus to be able to actually get the response. It's the Pavlov's dogs, you don't have to produce the meat to make the dog salivate. If you look at the images of it, it's actually a really messed up looking experiment, even though it's just salivating dogs. But they have to put metal tubes and stuff. But yeah, it's that whole entire idea that you don't need to have the primary stimulus, you need a secondary stimulus. And I think that's how morality is formed and how honor is, sort of maintained. Sam?
I'm not so the study is reasonably old, so I'm not really sure they looked at epigenetic changes within the monkeys, but it could be that there are epigenetic triggers that take place that have been encoded through natural selection but lie dormant until they're required. It's truthfully a field of genetics that we're only just starting to broach. So we may find that a lot of what we go, oh look, it can't be genetics, there's no selective pressure in play, it's one generation, could be just triggering previous selectivity. But it'll be interesting to see as we go on. Cool. That's all I got.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Simon. Another great episode, and thank you once again for tuning in, everybody. We hope that you tune in again next time.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord.